The battle for Mogilev in June-July 1944 cannot be understood in isolation. It was a critical component of Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet summer offensive that dismantled German Army Group Center. To appreciate the scale and consequences of the fighting around Mogilev, one must begin with the broader strategic picture at the end of 1943 and early 1944. Following the catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Wehrmacht in the east had been driven back steadily through Ukraine and Belarus. By spring 1944, the Germans maintained a broad defensive line running from the Baltic coast down through Belarus to Ukraine. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Ernst Busch, held a 1,000-kilometer front with approximately 850,000 troops. It was one of Germany's largest field armies, yet it faced... Within this framework, the city of Mogilev, located on the Dnieper River in eastern Belarus, was assigned to the German Fourth Army, commanded by General Kurt von Tippelskirch. Mogilev was considered a fortified strongpoint and designated a Fester Platz, or fortress, under Hitler's orders. This meant it was to be defended to the last man, regardless of the broader situation. Mogilev's significance was both strategic and symbolic. The city lay astride one of the main east-west transport corridors in Belarus, with road and rail links connecting it to Minsk and Orsha. Holding Mogilev was essential to maintaining communications within Army Group Center. German planning envisioned Mogilev serving as a pivot point to anchor defenses, slowing Soviet advances long enough for reinforcements to arrive. For Hitler, the fortress policy was also ideological. Fortified cities were to act as nails in the front line, delaying Soviet progress and demonstrating German determination. On the Soviet side, Mogilev represented a key operational objective. The Stavka, Soviet High Command, planned Operation Bagration as a coordinated strike to encircle and annihilate Army Group Center. The Second Belarusian Front, commanded by General Georgy Zakharov, was tasked with seizing Mogilev and breaking the German Fourth Army's defenses. Approximately 400,000 Soviet troops, with more than 5,000 guns and mortars, 700 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 1,000 aircraft, were committed to this sector. Mogilev's capture was intended not merely as a tactical victory, but as part of the larger encirclement that would culminate in the destruction of German forces around Minsk. By early June 1944, intelligence assessments made clear the disparity between the two sides. German divisions around Mogilev were understrength. Many infantry divisions fielded only 4,000, 5,000 combat troops, half their theoretical strength. Armor was scarce. Only a few dozen operational tanks and assault guns were available in the Fourth Army sector. Soviet reconnaissance identified these weaknesses, and partisan activity behind German lines further disrupted communications. Reports from German officers expressed concern that they could not withstand a major Soviet offensive, yet Hitler's orders left no room for withdrawal or flexible defense. The civilian population in and around Mogilev faced mounting hardships. The German occupation since 1941 had brought forced labor, deportations, and severe food requisitions. Partisan warfare was active in the forests of Belarus, and reprisals against suspected collaborators were common. By 1944, many villages around Mogilev had been burned and thousands of civilians displaced. For the population, the coming battle meant further destruction, as both sides prepared to turn the region into a battlefield. Thus, the preconditions for the Battle of Mogilev reflected the broader strategic turning of the war. For the Soviets, it was an opportunity to launch a decisive blow that could liberate Belarus and open the road to Poland. For the Germans, Mogilev was both a stronghold and a trap, designated as a fortress that had to be defended despite inadequate resources. The stage was set for a confrontation in which the disparity of forces, the rigidity of German orders, and the determination of the Red Army would combine to decide the fate of an entire army group. The Soviet offensive against Mogilev began on 23 June 1944 as part of the first wave of Operation Bagration. The Second Belarusian Front, under General Georgy Zakharov, opened its attack with a massive artillery preparation. Thousands of guns and mortars pounded German defensive lines for hours, targeting trenches, strong points, and artillery. Soviet air forces joined in, striking communications nodes, bridges, and troop concentrations. This combined arms bombardment was one of the heaviest yet employed on the Eastern Front, intended to paralyze German defenses before the ground assault began. Following the barrage, Soviet infantry advanced across a broad front east of Mogilev. The main assault was delivered by the 49th Army, commanded by General Ivan Grishin, with support from the 33rd Army and the 50th Army on its flanks. The German 4th Army, commanded by General Kurt von Tippelskirch, manned the defenses with divisions stretched thin along the Dnieper River line. Among them were the 12th, 31st, and 337th Infantry Divisions, each under strength, many battalions reduced to a few hundred men. Despite shortages, the German defenders attempted to hold under Hitler's orders to defend Mogilev at all costs. The initial Soviet advances met stubborn resistance. German infantry, supported by anti-tank guns and a handful of assault guns, fought from prepared positions on the eastern bank of the Dnieper. Villages such as Chaussy and Baikov became strong points, forcing Soviet units into costly frontal assaults. Soviet reports noted that the German defenders used every terrain advantage, forests, river bends, and marshy ground, to slow the advance. Nonetheless, the weight of Soviet numbers gradually overcame these defenses. By the evening of 24 June, Soviet forces had established several bridgeheads across the Dnieper north and south of Mogilev, threatening to envelop the city. German command reacted with local counterattacks. The 31st Infantry Division launched a series of small-scale counterstrokes with reserve battalions, briefly pushing Soviet units back from one bridgehead. However, these efforts were costly and unsustainable. With little armor and dwindling artillery ammunition, German counterattacks lacked the strength to restore the front. The 12th Infantry Division reported losing over 1,000 men in the first 2 days of fighting, reducing many of its companies to fewer than 50 soldiers. By 25 June, the scale of the Soviet offensive became clearer. The Second Belarusian Front expanded its assaults along a 60-kilometer sector, systematically targeting German strongpoints and isolating them with armor and artillery. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, operating further north, threatened to cut off retreat routes to the west, deepening German fears of encirclement. Reports from Army Group Center to OKH in Berlin emphasized the danger, but Hitler's directives still ordered the 4th Army to hold Mogilev. General Tippelskirch's requests for permission to withdraw were denied, locking his forces into defensive positions already under heavy pressure. The civilian population of Mogilev and surrounding villages was caught in the middle of the opening battles. Many residents had been conscripted into labor service by the Germans, building fortifications and repairing roads. As the Soviet bombardment intensified, civilians fled into cellars or nearby forests, but many were unable to escape. Fires broke out in the city as shells struck warehouses and homes, adding to the chaos. For those in German-occupied villages on the Dnieper line, the fighting meant mass displacement as front lines shifted rapidly. By the end of June's opening days, the German 4th Army faced a critical situation. Soviet spearheads had breached the outer defenses, established crossings of the Dnieper, and were pressing westward toward Mogilev itself. German attempts to stabilize the line failed, and divisions were rapidly losing cohesion under pressure. The opening phase of the battle revealed that Mogilev, designated a fortress, was in fact a trap. The Soviet plan to encircle and destroy German forces in this sector was already unfolding, and the city was becoming the focal point of a broader collapse. The Soviet High Command had envisioned the capture of Mogilev as a key step in the broader encirclement of Army Group Center, and by the end of June 1944, preparations for the city's isolation and destruction were in full motion. After the initial breakthroughs across the Dnieper, the Second Belarusian Front shifted its focus from merely breaching German defenses to tightening the noose around Mogilev itself. This stage of the battle was characterized by intense planning, heavy logistical operations, and the growing realization within the German command that the fortress concept imposed by Hitler had turned Mogilev into a death trap rather than a bastion. The strategic objectives for both sides diverged sharply. For the Soviets, General Zakharov's Second Belarusian Front was ordered to engage and fix the German Fourth Army around Mogilev, preventing its withdrawal westward. This fixation was intended to buy time for the First Belarusian and Third Belarusian fronts, which were advancing through Orsha and Bobruisk, to encircle Army Group Center in a massive pincer movement. Mogilev's defense thus served as a keystone in the German line, but also as a convenient pocket for the Soviets to crush once surrounding maneuvers were complete. Soviet planning papers emphasized that the goal was not only to take the city, but to destroy the enemy formations trapped within it. For the Germans, General Tippelskirch's Fourth Army had no illusions about its situation. Despite Hitler's order that Mogilev be held at all costs, Tippelskirch and his divisional commanders recognized the inadequacy of their resources. The army possessed approximately 120,000 troops at the outset of the battle, spread across multiple infantry divisions, but many units were skeletal. The 31st Infantry Division, for instance, was down to 6,500 men from a nominal strength of 15,000. Artillery ammunition was rationed, with reports that some batteries could fire only a dozen rounds per gun per day. Motorized transport was virtually non-existent, forcing the Germans to rely on horse-drawn carts that were vulnerable to Soviet air attack. Logistics played a decisive role in the Soviet plan. To maintain the tempo of the offensive, vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, and food had to be moved forward across broken terrain and hastily repaired railways. Engineer units built pontoon bridges across the Dnieper under constant fire, while rear services established depots to sustain the advancing armies. Supply lines stretched, but the Soviet system proved capable of supporting operations on a scale unimaginable just 2 years earlier. This logistical capability reflected both the maturation of the Red Army and the immense industrial base that the Soviet Union had mobilized since 1941. Propaganda also shaped perceptions of the battle. Soviet broadcasts trumpeted the inevitable fall of Mogilev, portraying it as a symbol of Nazi tyranny, soon to be erased. German propaganda, by contrast, insisted that Mogilev was a stronghold capable of holding out indefinitely, comparing it to earlier fortress defenses like Sevastopol. Yet within the Wehrmacht's ranks, morale suffered. Letters later intercepted by Soviet intelligence described soldiers doubting whether they would ever see Germany again. Commanders attempted to bolster discipline by emphasizing Hitler's orders, but the reality of Soviet numerical and material superiority was plain to all. Soviet deception efforts, part of the larger Maskirovka operations of Bagration, also contributed to German miscalculations. While the Second Belarusian Front pressed against Mogilev, German intelligence believed the main Soviet thrusts would remain concentrated further north and south. As a result, reserves that might have been used to relieve Mogilev were instead directed toward Orsha and Bobruisk, leaving Tippelskirch's army without meaningful support. This dispersion of effort reflected the larger problem faced by Army Group Center. It was stretched across an immense front without sufficient resources to respond effectively anywhere. The German High Command at OKH in Berlin continued to send directives reinforcing Hitler's order that Mogilev must be held to the last man. Requests for a withdrawal to more defensible positions closer to Minsk were rejected. Tippelskirch's reports to Army Group Center emphasized the risk of encirclement, but Field Marshal Busch, constrained by Hitler's rigid instructions, could not authorize retreat. Thus, German troops in Mogilev found themselves ordered to defend a fortress that had already lost its strategic purpose, forced into static positions while Soviet pincers closed around them. Civilians in Mogilev faced worsening conditions as the city braced for siege. Thousands had been forced into labor constructing bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and barricades within the city limits. Food supplies dwindled as German forces requisitioned remaining stocks for their own use. Soviet artillery fire in late June struck warehouses, homes, and public buildings, further deepening the crisis. Many residents fled into surrounding forests, while others sought shelter in basements, awaiting the inevitable street fighting. Soviet intelligence estimated that fewer than 20,000 civilians remained in Mogilev by the time the city was fully encircled. On the Soviet side, preparations included not only logistical buildup, but also careful operational planning. Grishin's 49th Army received direct orders to take Mogilev from the east, while flank armies were to advance north and south to seal the city. Tank units were positioned to cut the Mogilev-Minsk highway, the last major retreat route available to the Germans. Soviet artillery was brought forward in mass, with concentrations of up to 200 guns per kilometer on selected sectors. The Air Force played a critical role, with the 16th Air Army flying hundreds of sorties daily against German troop movements and supply convoys, further strangling the defenders' ability to maneuver. By 27 June, the Soviet encirclement of Mogilev was nearly complete. German forces, the once prized fortress had become a cauldron, filled with exhausted divisions running short on food and ammunition. Soviet commanders prepared for the final assault, determined to crush the garrison swiftly and move on toward Minsk. Within the German ranks, the realization set in that Mogilev's fate had been sealed not by its defenders' will, but by the broader collapse of Army Group Center. The strategic planning stage was ending, and the battle was about to transform into a brutal confrontation within the city itself, where soldiers and civilians alike would face the consequences of Hitler's fortress policy. On 27 June 1944, the fighting for Mogilev erupted into full-scale engagements as the Soviet encirclement tightened. The 49th Army, supported by the 33rd and 50th Armies on its flanks, launched coordinated assaults against German outer defenses east and south of the city. Artillery barrages preceded infantry advances, with concentrations so heavy that entire German trench lines were obliterated before Soviet troops moved forward. The German Fourth Army, commanded by General Kurt von Tippelskirch, attempted to hold its ground, but divisions such as the 12th and 31st Infantry were already critically weakened. Many companies were reduced to 30-40 men, unable to man their entire sectors. The first Soviet probes met stiff resistance in fortified villages surrounding Mogilev. German units had constructed fieldworks, bunkers, and minefields, forcing Soviet attackers into costly frontal engagements. Villages such as Bunichi and Belenichi became focal points, with German defenders fighting from house to house. Soviet flamethrower units and assault engineers cleared bunkers systematically, while artillery and mortars leveled entire blocks to suppress resistance. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but the disparity in resources meant the Soviets could continue to commit fresh battalions where German reserves were non-existent. By 28 June, Soviet spearheads had broken through the eastern defenses and approached Mogilev's suburbs. German command attempted to organize counterattacks with remnants of the 337th Infantry Division and a few assault guns from Corps reserves, but these efforts quickly faltered. Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by swarms of infantry, overran German strongpoints one after another. Reports from Tippelskirch's headquarters described isolated resistance rather than coherent defensive lines as communication broke down and entire battalions were cut off. Civilians inside the city endured bombardments that left entire districts in ruins. Artillery fire set fires across Mogilev, and food supplies ran out as German troops requisitioned remaining stocks. Eyewitness accounts collected after the war described terrified families sheltering in basements while street fighting raged above. The German occupation authorities, aware of the impending Soviet assault, began hurried evacuations of wounded and administrative personnel but with the highways west already under Soviet fire, few succeeded in escaping. Soviet advances from the north and south further sealed the city's fate. By the evening of 28th June, the Mogilev-Minsk highway had been cut, trapping the garrison inside. Units of the 50th Army advancing from the south linked with elements of the 49th Army, encircling the bulk of the German 12th and 31st Infantry Divisions. The city itself now became a cauldron, its defenders ordered to fight to the last under Hitler's Fortress Directive. Morale among German troops plummeted. Diaries and later testimonies describe exhausted soldiers, many without ammunition or rations, attempting to hold rubble-strewn streets against superior Soviet forces. Some units surrendered en masse, while others fought on in small groups, hoping for orders to retreat that never came. Soviet reports noted the capture of hundreds of prisoners in just a few hours, alongside the destruction of isolated German strongpoints that refused to yield. By 29 June, Soviet troops had pushed into Mogilev proper. Fighting devolved into urban combat, with Soviet rifle divisions advancing block by block, supported by tanks and artillery firing directly into fortified buildings. German machine gun nests and snipers slowed progress, but could not halt it. The 49th Army's commander, General Ivan Grishin, reported that organized resistance was collapsing, and that Soviet units were securing bridges, depots, and rail stations. Fires consumed large parts of the city, and with no functioning water supply, destruction spread unchecked. The first engagements thus transitioned rapidly from assaults on outer defensive belts to a full-scale battle inside Mogilev. Soviet forces methodically overwhelmed German defenders, while German command clung to Hitler's order to hold the fortress, condemning its troops to destruction. For the Red Army, Mogilev represented not just a tactical victory, but proof that the German fortress policy was fatally flawed. For the Germans, it was the beginning of total collapse, as the fall of Mogilev meant the Fourth Army was now doomed to encirclement within days. By the end of 29 June 1944, the battle for Mogilev had reached its most violent phase. The city itself became the center of destruction, with Soviet troops advancing from multiple directions into streets already reduced to rubble by artillery. The 49th Army pressed from the east, while elements of the 50th Army encircled from the south, and the 33rd Army moved in from the north, leaving the defenders trapped within a tightening perimeter. German troops of the 12th, 31st, and 337th Infantry Divisions, numbering no more than 25,000 combat-effective men at this stage, attempted to hold strong points throughout the city. Soviet estimates later suggested that more than 15,000 German soldiers were encircled within Mogilev alone, with another 10,000 scattered in the surrounding countryside. Street fighting quickly turned into a brutal contest of attrition. German defenders fortified key intersections, factories, and government buildings, converting them into machine gun nests and sniper positions. Anti-tank ditches and makeshift barricades were constructed using destroyed vehicles and debris. Soviet commanders responded by employing combined arms assault groups, small teams of riflemen, sappers, and flamethrowers supported by self-propelled guns. These units advanced methodically, blasting open fortified basements and bunkers before storming them with close-range fire. Accounts from Soviet engineers describe clearing entire blocks house by house, where each building could take hours to secure. On 30th June, Soviet pressure reached a crescendo. Artillery barrages flattened entire districts, and the 16th Air Army maintained constant bombardment, striking German concentrations within the city and along possible retreat routes. Despite these efforts, pockets of German resistance continued to inflict heavy casualties. At one intersection, remnants of the 31st Infantry Division, supported by a few assault guns, delayed the Soviet 121st Rifle Division for nearly half a day. Communications between German units had broken down, with only sporadic radio transmissions reaching Tippelskirche's headquarters. The civilian population bore the full weight of the battle. With supplies exhausted, hunger spread rapidly. Families emerged from basements in search of food and water, only to be caught in crossfire. Fires raged through residential districts, consuming entire streets. Many civilians were pressed into service by the Germans to construct barricades or carry ammunition, while others sought to aid advancing Soviet troops by pointing out German strongpoints. Later, Soviet reports noted the evacuation of several thousand civilians from Mogilev once the city had been secured, though the majority endured the destruction until the end. By this stage, Hitler's directive to hold Mogilev at all costs had become an impossible burden. German commanders on the ground recognized the futility of further resistance. Requests to withdraw were sent repeatedly, but higher headquarters delayed authorization. Field Marshal Busch, commanding Army Group Center, finally issued belated orders for a breakout on 28 June, but by then, Soviet forces had already severed all major routes west. Units attempting to escape were cut down by Soviet tanks and artillery along the Dnieper crossings. One German regiment that tried to break through toward Minsk lost over 60% of its strength in a single day. Soviet commanders, meanwhile, pushed relentlessly to complete the destruction. Grishin's 49th Army reported the capture of Mogilev's railway station and river port by midday on 30 June. The Red Army flag was raised over the city administration building shortly after. Organized resistance crumbled, though scattered German troops continued fighting in small groups across ruins and factories. Soviet reports indicate that by the evening of 30 June, most of the city was under their control, with only minor pockets still resisting in the western outskirts. The scale of German losses during these days was catastrophic. Soviet figures claim that more than 35,000 German troops were killed or captured in the Mogilev sector between 23 and 30 June. While German sources dispute the exact numbers, even conservative estimates confirm that entire divisions were effectively annihilated. The 12th Infantry Division ceased to exist as a fighting force, while the 31st and 337th Divisions were reduced to fragments. Prisoner counts alone exceeded 10,000, including several regimental commanders. For the Soviets, the capture of Mogilev represented both a symbolic and strategic success. Symbolically, it was the liberation of a major city that had been under occupation since July 1941. Strategically, it demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet operational planning and the futility of the German fortress policy. More importantly, it freed the Second Belarusian Front to push westward toward Minsk, accelerating the encirclement of the entire German Fourth Army. The defenders of Mogilev had been sacrificed, their destruction contributing to the broader collapse of Army Group Center during Operation Bagration. Yet the battle did not end with the fall of the city itself. In the days that followed, scattered German groups continued desperate breakout attempts, most of which were intercepted and destroyed by Soviet pursuit units. The roads west of Mogilev became littered with burned-out vehicles, abandoned artillery, and the bodies of soldiers who had tried to escape too late. Soviet cavalry and tank units swept through the countryside, rounding up survivors and consolidating their control. Mogilev, once proclaimed a fortress to be held at all costs, now lay in ruins, its defenders destroyed, and its capture serving as another proof that the German line in Belarus was collapsing irreversibly. The peak of the Mogilev fighting thus highlighted the futility of Hitler's static defensive orders. Instead of delaying the Soviets, the city became a graveyard for thousands of German troops, accelerating the destruction of the Fourth Army and opening the way for the Red Army's advance toward the heart of Belarus. The fall of Mogilev on 30 June did not mark the end of the fighting in the sector. For several more days, remnants of the German Fourth Army attempted desperate measures to escape destruction. With Soviet forces closing in from all directions, German units were ordered to break westward through the Berezina River line. But by the time these orders arrived, the Red Army's advance had already made such a movement nearly impossible. The 12th Infantry Division, which had once formed part of Mogilev's main garrison, was virtually annihilated. Survivors, no more than a few hundred men scattered in small groups, tried to slip through the forests west of the city. Most were intercepted by Soviet cavalry detachments or surrounded by local partisan units who had become increasingly active as the German line collapsed. The 31st Infantry Division fared little better, with entire battalions wiped out during futile attempts to cross Soviet-controlled highways and rivers. The 337th Infantry Division, which had defended the southern sector, lost cohesion entirely. Its survivors retreated in disorder, abandoning heavy equipment along the way. Soviet pursuit operations were swift and systematic. Tank brigades moved rapidly along the Mogilev-Minsk road, cutting off retreating columns and capturing stragglers. Cavalry corps exploited wooded areas to encircle small German groups. Artillery units shelled crossings and choke points where the Germans might attempt to reorganize. The 16th Air Army maintained unrelenting air superiority, with fighters and bombers attacking bridges, convoys, and isolated strongpoints. Reports indicate that hundreds of German vehicles, many already damaged or short on fuel, were destroyed in these strikes. Partisans played a significant role during this stage. Belarusian partisan formations, numbering tens of thousands by mid-1944, harassed German escape attempts, sabotaged bridges, and guided Soviet troops through forest paths. In some cases, they captured German stragglers and handed them over to advancing Red Army units. The coordination between Soviet regular forces and partisans demonstrated how far the resistance movement had developed since the early years of occupation, when it had been fragmented and poorly supplied. Many had fought for days without food or rest, surrounded by burning villages and the sounds of constant bombardment. Prisoner interrogations conducted later by the Soviets reveal that morale collapsed almost completely after Mogilev's encirclement. Soldiers spoke of confusion, despair, and the belief that they had been abandoned by their high command. Officers admitted that orders to hold the city to the last man were impossible to fulfill and only prolonged unnecessary suffering. For civilians, the aftermath was equally grim. Mogilev lay in ruins, with entire districts destroyed by artillery and airstrikes. Infrastructure, including bridges, railways, and the water system, was shattered. Soviet authorities arriving after the battle reported widespread devastation, burned-out homes, and mass graves of executed civilians from the occupation years. Relief operations began immediately. Thousands of displaced residents wandered the countryside, searching for relatives or shelter in villages that themselves had suffered under occupation. By early July, organized German resistance east of the Berezina had ceased. The Red Army pressed westward with remarkable speed, turning Mogilev from a battle site into a rear area hub for supply and medical operations. The destruction of German forces in the sector contributed directly to the larger encirclement of Army Group Center, which culminated in the capture of Minsk on 3rd July. For the Soviet High Command, Mogilev was one link in a chain of victories that shattered German control in Belarus. The German attempt to adapt to the disaster was minimal. Field Marshal Busch, under immense pressure from Hitler, tried to reorganize scattered remnants into rear guards, but the pace of Soviet advance rendered such efforts ineffective. The fortress concept, intended to buy time, had instead accelerated losses. With Mogilev gone and the Fourth Army effectively destroyed, the path to Minsk and beyond was open, confirming that Operation Bagration was not simply a successful offensive, but a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. The Mogilev battle thus entered its phase of resistance and adaptation not through renewed German initiative, but through the systematic disintegration of their ability to fight. The Soviet Union demonstrated operational maturity in coordinating multiple fronts, employing combined arms, and integrating partisan warfare into its strategy. German forces, by contrast, adapted only by breaking into small groups and attempting to flee, leaving behind their heavy weapons and their dead. What had been envisioned as a fortress city capable of holding the line became a graveyard, its fall ensuring that the German front in Belarus could not be restored. The turning point in the battle for Mogilev emerged not only from the fall of the city itself, but from the collapse of the German defensive system in the entire sector of the front. Once Mogilev had been encircled and overrun, the Soviet encirclement strategy achieved its intended effect. The German Fourth Army, already under pressure across a 200-kilometer front, lost any hope of organized retreat. By early July 1944, what remained of its divisions was scattered across forests, swamps, and broken road networks, unable to regroup or establish coherent lines of resistance. For the Soviet command, the critical breakthrough was secured when tank and mechanized units cut the Mogilev-Minsk highway and blocked crossings over the Berezina. This maneuver eliminated the last operational escape route for German forces retreating west. Soviet accounts describe how, by 2nd of July, units of the Second Belarusian Front had advanced up to 70 kilometers beyond Mogilev, linking with spearheads from other fronts and sealing the larger encirclement of Army Group Center. The destruction of Mogilev's garrison was thus both a local and a strategic turning point. The fortress that had been ordered to hold to the last was now erased, and with it the backbone of the German Fourth Army. German documents captured after the battle reveal the desperation of this stage. Orders issued by Field Marshal Busch called for regrouping west of the Berezina, but the reality on the ground made this impossible. Divisions were reduced to mere Kampfgruppen of a few hundred men, often without heavy weapons. Prisoners taken by the Soviets reported that in some units, fewer than 20% of soldiers still had rifles, and ammunition stocks were depleted to the point where combat lasted only. Retreating soldiers abandoned artillery, vehicles, and supplies along roads, creating a trail of destruction that Soviet forces exploited to accelerate their advance. For civilians across the Mogilev region, the turning point was marked by liberation, but also by devastation. Soviet troops found villages destroyed by both retreating Germans and the battle itself. Survivors emerged from hiding to greet advancing units, though many were malnourished, displaced, and traumatized by years of occupation. In Mogilev itself, Red Army reports emphasized the urgent need to restore order and provide basic necessities to thousands of residents who had endured the siege. Food kitchens were set up, and the NKVD immediately began screening the population for collaborators, while medical teams attempted to treat the wounded in makeshift hospitals established in surviving schools and churches. Soviet propaganda emphasized the turning point as proof that Hitler's fortress policy had collapsed under its own weight. Newspapers such as Pravda reported the fall of Mogilev as evidence that German attempts to hold fixed positions were futile against Soviet operational art and numerical superiority. For German soldiers and commanders, however, the turning point meant irreversible defeat. Attempts to regroup further west were constantly intercepted, and the fall of Mogilev marked the loss of an entire army's command and control structure. The immediate repercussions extended beyond the battlefield. The destruction of the Fourth Army at Mogilev and in surrounding sectors exposed the southern flank of Army Group Center, leaving the road to Minsk undefended. This, in turn, enabled the Red Army to complete one of the largest encirclements of the war during Operation Bagration. By mid-July, Army Group Center had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, with losses exceeding 300,000 men. Mogilev's fall was not the sole cause of this catastrophe, but it was a crucial pivot in the chain of events that led to it. For the Germans, the turning point was recognized too late. Belated withdrawal orders, issued under pressure from commanders on the ground, arrived only when Soviet pincers had already closed. Survivors who reached German lines further west did so in small, fragmented groups, many without officers or equipment. These remnants could not halt the Red Army's momentum. For the Soviets, the battle confirmed the effectiveness of their coordination across multiple fronts and the maturity of their operational planning. The turning point was thus not only tactical, but also the collapse of German resistance around Mogilev thus represents the defining turning point of the operation. What began as a localized struggle for a fortress city concluded with the destruction of an entire army, reshaping the balance of power on the Eastern Front. From this moment, the Red Armies advanced toward Minsk and ultimately toward the borders of Poland and East Prussia could no longer be checked by the German forces that once dominated the region. The aftermath of the Mogilev battle unfolded rapidly as Soviet forces secured the ruins of the city and pressed relentlessly westward. By 1st July 1944, the organized defense of Mogilev had ceased, with isolated German pockets either destroyed or captured. Soviet rifle divisions completed mopping up operations within the city, clearing remaining resistance from industrial areas, railway yards, and the western suburbs. NKVD units moved in shortly afterward to restore order, conduct sweeps for collaborators, and begin documenting evidence of German occupation crimes. The scale of German retreat and destruction was immense. The fortress policy had locked entire divisions inside Mogilev until their annihilation, and those who attempted breakout did so under constant Soviet pursuit. South and west of the city, roads were lined with wrecked artillery, burned trucks, and abandoned horse-drawn wagons. Prisoner columns, numbering in the thousands, were escorted eastward. Soviet accounts noted the capture of divisional commanders and staff officers, underscoring the completeness of the collapse. Contemporary German reports conceded that the remnants of several divisions ceased to exist as combat formations. For the civilian population, the end of the siege was both liberation and catastrophe. Mogilev itself was left devastated. Soviet estimates suggested that up to 70% of the city's housing stock had been destroyed during the battle. Fires burned uncontrolled for days, consuming wooden structures and warehouses. Food and medical supplies were nearly non-existent. Civilians who had survived in basements emerged to find their homes in ruins and their city reduced to rubble. Immediate relief operations focused on distributing bread and soup from military field kitchens, but famine and disease threatened in the weeks that followed. The humanitarian crisis extended to surrounding villages, where retreating German troops had often implemented scorched earth tactics. Barns were burned, crops destroyed, and wells poisoned. Soviet reports from liberated areas describe mass graves of civilians executed during the occupation or in reprisals carried out during the retreat. The NKVD documented these atrocities, forwarding evidence to commissions investigating German war crimes. For survivors, liberation came at the cost of devastation, displacement, and the loss of family members. Militarily, the consequences of Mogilev's fall were immediate and severe for the Wehrmacht. The destruction of the garrison removed any chance for the Fourth Army to withdraw in an organized fashion. Soviet mechanized corps advanced west, cutting off stragglers and preventing regrouping. By 3rd July, Minsk was encircled, and what remained of the Fourth Army was either destroyed or captured in the Berezina pocket. Mogilev's fall thus directly contributed to the collapse of Army Group Center, one of the most decisive Soviet victories of the war. The Soviet leadership highlighted the victory in official reports and propaganda. Radio broadcasts declared Mogilev liberated, and Stalin personally mentioned the operation in one of his orders of the day, praising the second. Newspapers printed images of Red Army soldiers marching through the ruins and of civilians embracing their liberators. Yet behind the triumphal narrative lay the immense human cost. Tens of thousands dead, a city in ruins, and survivors facing an uncertain future under military administration. German sources later acknowledged that Mogilev had become a symbol of the failure of fortress defense. The city, once proclaimed vital to holding the Dnieper line, was turned into a trap that consumed irreplaceable manpower. Officers who survived criticized Hitler's refusal to authorize timely withdrawals, noting that divisions lost at Mogilev might have been saved to fight further west. The destruction weakened not only the Fourth Army, but the entire Army Group Center, hastening the collapse of German control in Belarus. The immediate consequences for the Soviet advance were profound. With Mogilev secured, supply lines were quickly rerouted through the city's rail junction, allowing reinforcements, ammunition, and fuel to flow toward the front. Engineers repaired bridges and cleared mines, transforming the ruined city into a logistical hub for further operations. From Mogilev, Soviet forces advanced deeper into Belarus, completing the encirclement of German armies and pushing inexorably toward Poland. Thus, the aftermath of the Mogilev battle was defined by destruction, capture, and humanitarian disaster, but also by the transformation of the battlefield into a springboard for further offensives. The city that had symbolized German defiance became instead a testament to the futility of Hitler's defensive doctrine, its ruins serving as both evidence of Nazi collapse and a foundation for Soviet victory in the summer of 1940. The withdrawal from Mogilev and its surrounding sectors in early July 1944 was not an orderly retreat, but a rout marked by collapse and devastation. Once the city fell, remnants of the German Fourth Army attempted to escape westward toward the Berezina, but by that stage, Soviet spearheads had already severed the main arteries of movement. German columns moving through forests and secondary roads were subjected to relentless attacks from Soviet tank units, artillery, and aircraft. Entire groups were destroyed before they could reach the river, their remnants scattered in swamps and fields. The immediate end of combat operations left Mogilev itself in ruins. Soviet troops completed their clearance of the city by 1 July, rounding up the last German holdouts in basements and fortified buildings. Prisoner counts mounted by the hour as starving and exhausted soldiers surrendered in groups. Soviet reports recorded thousands of captives, including senior staff officers, captured maps, and communications equipment. The destruction of the German garrison was so complete that divisions once numbering over 10,000 men were reduced to scattered survivors numbering in the hundreds. Reprisals and devastation followed in the countryside. As German forces withdrew in disorder, they destroyed infrastructure, burned villages, and executed suspected partisans or civilians accused of aiding the Soviets. Soviet commissions arriving afterward documented widespread atrocities. Barns set ablaze with families inside, hanged villagers left as warnings, and fields stripped of grain. These actions reflected both the chaos of retreat and deliberate scorched earth orders intended to deny resources to the Red Army. For local populations, the price of liberation was paid in destroyed homes, lost relatives, and famine conditions. The humanitarian crisis deepened in the weeks that followed. Mogilev's infrastructure had collapsed under bombardment and fighting. Bridges were destroyed, rail lines severed, and warehouses emptied. Survivors lived among the ruins, dependent on Soviet field kitchens and improvised shelters. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, treating both wounded soldiers and civilians suffering from burns, shrapnel injuries, and malnutrition. The NKVD began systematic registration of civilians, separating those suspected of collaboration with the occupiers from the broader population, while political commissars organized rallies to celebrate liberation despite the bleak conditions. The German retreat itself was marked by desperation. Units attempting to regroup at the Berezina were surrounded and destroyed in the great encirclement that culminated in the fall of Minsk on 3rd July. Mogilev's loss had sealed this fate. The fortress defense had tied down divisions until it was too late for them to escape. The garrison's destruction meant that Army Group Center no longer had reserves capable of halting the Soviet offensive. In effect, Mogilev became the grave of the German Fourth Army, with survivors contributing little to subsequent defensive efforts in Belarus. Soviet pursuit forces pushed beyond Mogilev almost immediately. Mechanized corps, supplied through hastily repaired bridges and roads, advanced up to 40 kilometers per day, cutting off German stragglers. Cavalry units cleared forests of fugitives, while partisan groups captured escapees and destroyed columns attempting to bypass the main highways. The speed of the Soviet advance made organized German withdrawal impossible, ensuring that the fall of Mogilev fed directly into the broader collapse of Army Group Center. The devastation of Mogilev itself left a lasting impression. The city was largely unrecognizable, its factories destroyed, residential areas burned, and cultural landmarks reduced to rubble. The legacy of the battle for Mogilev extends beyond the destruction of a single city or the annihilation of several German divisions. It is remembered as a key component of Operation Bagration, the offensive that shattered Army Group Center and changed the balance of the war on the Eastern Front. Mogilev's fall was one link in a chain of Soviet victories that collectively erased German control over Belarus and set the stage for the liberation of Eastern Europe. In military terms, the battle demonstrated the maturity of Soviet operational art. The Red Army successfully coordinated multiple fronts, employed deception to mask its intentions, and combined artillery, armor, infantry, and air power to overwhelm entrenched divisions that might have retreated and regrouped were instead lost entirely, contributing to the encirclement at Minsk and the collapse of German strategic cohesion in the region. German military historians later acknowledged Mogilev as an example of the dangers inherent in Hitler's interference with operational decisions. By refusing timely withdrawals, the German High Command squandered manpower and material that were already in short supply. The Fourth Army's destruction at Mogilev and its failure to retreat when it still had the opportunity weakened the entire defensive line and accelerated the collapse of Army Group Center. Survivors of the battle became scattered remnants, incapable of forming coherent rearguards or halting the Soviet advance. For the Soviet Union, the capture of Mogilev held symbolic as well as strategic value. The city had been under occupation since July 1941, and its liberation was presented in official propaganda as both vengeance and Stalin's orders of the day singled out Mogilev as a fortress torn from German hands, and Soviet media emphasized the role of common soldiers in bringing the city back into Soviet control. Photographs and newsreels of Red Army troops marching through ruins circulated widely, framing the victory as part of the unstoppable liberation of Belarus. The human legacy, however, was darker. Mogilev was devastated, with most of its infrastructure destroyed. Civilians returned to rubble, facing famine, homelessness, and the trauma of years under occupation, followed by days of brutal street fighting. Soviet commissions cataloged war crimes and mass executions carried out by German occupation authorities, documenting the suffering of the population. Reconstruction efforts. The memory of Mogilev became embedded in post-war Soviet narratives of the Great Patriotic War. The battle was cited in military academies as an example of successful encirclement operations, reinforcing doctrines of deep battle and coordinated offensives. Commemorative monuments were erected in Mogilev, honoring both Red Army soldiers and civilian victims. Annual ceremonies reinforced the narrative of sacrifice and victory, ensuring that the city's ordeal remained a part of collective memory. In Western accounts, Mogilev has often been overshadowed by larger battles of Operation Bagration, such as Minsk or Bobruisk. Yet military historians emphasize that without the fixation of German forces at Mogilev, the broader encirclement would not have been so swift or decisive. The destruction of the fortress city illustrated how local battles fed into strategic outcomes, shaping the course of the campaign and accelerating. The cultural consequences extended into how the war was remembered. In Belarus, Mogilev came to symbolize resilience and survival. Its ruins stood as a reminder of both the devastation of occupation and the costs of liberation. In Germany, the battle became a symbol of wasted lives and flawed strategy, a case study in the futility of blind obedience to Hitler's fortress orders. Today, the battle for Mogilev is studied as both a military event and a humanitarian tragedy. It underscores the complexity of total war, where cities became battlegrounds, civilians endured siege and destruction, and armies were consumed in battles dictated by rigid political decisions. The crushing of the German line at Mogilev was not only a moment of triumph for the Soviet Union, but also a harbinger of the rapid collapse of Nazi power in Eastern Europe. Its legacy endures as a stark reminder of how strategic doctrine